I've been waiting for this.
Me too.
The air in the private study smelled of rain, expensive tobacco, and the ozone of a looming storm. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Busan was a sprawling grid of neon veins, but inside, the silence was heavy enough to crush. Taehyun stood by the mahogany desk, his tailored jacket discarded, the sleeves of his black silk shirt rolled back to reveal the silver ink of the serpent coiling around his forearm. He wasn't looking at the city he ruled. He was looking at me. "You should have taken the jet," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "I gave you an exit. I gave you a way out of this bloodbath before the first shot was even fired." I didn't flinch. I stood my ground in the center of the room, my satin gown shimmering like spilled oil under the dim chandelier. I don't run from investments, Taehyun, and I don't run from men who think they can decide my fate for me. He moved then, faster than a man of his size should be able to. In a heartbeat, he was in my space, the heat radiating off him a stark contrast to the coldness in his eyes. He didn't grab me. He didn't have to. His presence was its own cage. Slowly, almost tentatively, he reached out. His hand didn't go for my waist or my hair. Instead, his thumb found the pulse point at the base of my throat, tracing the delicate line where a rival's blade had nearly found its mark an hour earlier. His skin was rough, calloused from years of holding power and weapons, yet his touch was devastatingly light. "You're a glitch in the system, Aari," he murmured, leaning down until his lips were inches from my ear. "A variable I didn't account for. My advisors call you a weakness. They say a king who looks at a woman the way I look at you is a king who is ready to fall." I felt my heart hammer against his thumb, a frantic rhythm he surely felt. "And are you ready to fall?" He pulled back just enough to look me in the eye, his expression unreadable, the crowned serpent finally showing his fangs. The vulnerability I'd seen earlier was gone, replaced by a terrifying, absolute clarity. "I don't do love," he whispered, his thumb pressing just a fraction firmer against my jugular, a ghost of a threat and a promise all at once. "But for you, I might just do war." He let go, the absence of his touch feeling like a cold front. He turned toward the array of monitors on his desk, the digital blueprints of his empire flickering to life. The transition was seamless, from a man on the edge of a confession to a commander preparing for a siege. "Lock the door," he commanded, not looking back. "The council is downstairs. They think they're here for a meeting. They don't realize they're here for an execution." The air in the restricted wing of the Hyundai penthouse was filtered, cool, and smelled faintly of expensive cedar and something sharper, metallic, like the edge of a blade. I had ignored the staff-only sign, not out of rebellion, but because the venture capitalists in the main ballroom were suffocating me with their polite condescension. I needed a moment of silence to breathe. Instead, I found a nightmare. The heavy double doors drifted open with a silent hydraulic hiss. The room beyond was a stark contrast to the gold-leafed gala behind me. Here, the lighting was recessed and clinical, casting long, jagged shadows across a floor of polished obsidian. In the center of the room, 3 men stood in a tense semicircle. 2 were older, their faces pale and slick with sweat, but the third, the one standing over a mahogany table littered with blueprints and a single blood-flecked silk handkerchief, was different. Kang Taehyun. The crowned serpent was younger than the legend suggested, but his presence was a physical weight. He had discarded his suit jacket, and his dark silk shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the intricate black and silver ink that crawled up his throat like a living thing. He held a small, weighted stylus in one hand, tapping it against the table with a rhythmic, hypnotic thud. "I told you." Taehyun's voice was a low, melodic rasp that sent a shiver down my spine. "The port is mine. If you move a single shipment without my seal, you won't just lose the cargo. You'll lose the hands that touched it." One of the men gasped, his eyes darting toward the door. Taehyun's gaze followed. In the underworld, a witness is a liability to be liquidated. I knew I should run, scream, or at least tremble. Instead, I adjusted the cuff of my structured blazer and stepped fully into the light. My Nigerian French heritage had gifted me with a height that usually intimidated men. Today, it was my only armor. Taehyun straightened, his dark eyes narrowing as they swept over my mahogany skin and the defiant set of my shoulders. He stepped toward me, his movements fluid and predatory. He stopped so close I could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and danger. "You're a long way from the Champagne Towers, Princess," he murmured, his voice dropping to a private, lethal frequency. "Do you have any idea what happens to people who overhear the serpent's business?" He expected me to blink. He expected the frantic apology of a socialite who had lost her way. But I had built a tech empire in rooms full of men who wanted me to fail. I didn't blink. I looked him dead in his unreadable eyes, my reflection caught in the dark iris of a killer. "I imagine you try to scare them," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the tension like a diamond. "But I'm not here for your business, Mr. Kang. I'm here for your investors. And if you're as smart as they say, you'll realize that killing your best potential partner is a very poor ROI. A flicker of something, amusement, intrigue, crossed his face. The serpent had found something he couldn't immediately crush, and for the first time in his life, he looked genuinely unsettled. The morning sun hit the glass of Taehyun's office like a physical blow, but the temperature inside remained a steady clinical chill. I sat across from him, my spine straight, refusing the espresso his silent, scarred assistant had placed before me. On the desk between us lay a document bound in heavy black leather, a contract that had nothing to do with fashion tech and everything to do with my disappearance from the world I knew. "A strategic partnership," Taehyun said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. He was back in his armor, a charcoal three-piece suit, the top button fastened, the tattoos hidden beneath silk and wool. Only the sharp line of his jaw betrayed the predator I'd met in the dark the night before. "My venture firm, Serpentis Holdings, will provide the primary Series A funding for your startup. In exchange, you will move your operations to my headquarters. You will live in the residential wing of my estate. You will be shadowed by my security 24 hours a day." "That's not a merger," I countered, my voice tight. "That's a kidnapping with a better tax bracket." Taehyun leaned forward, the movement bringing the scent of sandalwood and cold iron back into my lungs. "It's survival, Aari. You walked into a room where blood was being negotiated. My rivals now know your face. They know you saw me. In their world, that makes you a lever. In mine, it makes you a target." He slid a gold fountain pen towards me. It caught the light, gleaming like a gilded cage. I looked at the pen, then at the man who held the keys to my freedom and my safety. The Nigerian girl in me, the one who had clawed her way through boards of directors who wanted her silent, wanted to laugh in his face. But the tech founder in me saw the logic. He wasn't just offering money, he was offering a shield. "I don't take orders, Taehyun," I said, leaning in until we were inches apart, mimicking the predatory grace he used to unsettle others. "I take meetings. If I sign this, I am a partner, not a prisoner. My tech remains mine. My autonomy remains mine. And your men? They stay 6 feet back unless I'm bleeding." A slow, dangerous smile pulled at the corner of his mouth, the first sign of genuine life I'd seen in his controlled expression. It wasn't a smile of kindness. It was the look of a man who had finally found a worthy opponent. "Partners, then," he murmured, his eyes tracking the movement of my hand as I reached for the pen. "But remember, Aari, in Busan, the serpent doesn't just protect what's his. He consumes anyone who tries to take it." I signed my name in a sharp, decisive script. As the ink dried, the heavy click of the office door locking behind me echoed through the room. The golden handcuffs were on. The transition from a glass-walled penthouse to the serpent's estate felt like moving from a dream into a fortress. The air inside the residential wing was heavy, with the scent of rain and old ink. I was working late in the library, the blue light of my holographic interface casting long shadows against the mahogany shelves, when the door groaned open. Taehyun walked in, his gait heavy, his movements stripped of their usual calculated elegance. He had discarded his dress shirt, wearing only a loose black silk robe that hung open, revealing the true extent of the canvas that was his body. Under the sharp glow of my screen, the silver and black tattoos seemed to writhe. But as he reached for a crystal decanter of whiskey, the light hit him differently. "The ink doesn't cover everything, does it?" I murmured, my fingers pausing over the keyboard. He froze, his back to me. Between the coiling scales of the serpent on his shoulder blade was a jagged, angry ridge of white scar tissue, a map of a betrayal that had predated his crown. He turned slowly, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Ink is for the world to see, Aari. Scars are for the man to remember." He sat in the velvet armchair opposite my desk, the glass clinking against his ring. "And you? You move through these rooms like you own the air, yet you keep your encryption layers deeper than my security protocols. What are you hiding behind that poise?" I leaned back, the weight of 1,000 no's from Silicon Valley to Seoul pressing against my chest. "It's not a secret, Taehyun. It's a survival mechanism. In my world, a woman who looks like me isn't allowed to have a bad day or a rough draft. If my code isn't perfect, it's because I'm unqualified. If my tone isn't soft, I'm aggressive. I don't have the luxury of scars. I have to be made of marble." Taehyun studied me, his gaze dropping to my hands, which were still tight with the tension of a decade spent proving my right to exist in elite spaces. For the first time, the predatory edge in his expression softened into something resembling recognition. He knew what it was to be an outsider holding a kingdom together with sheer will. "They look at us and see weapons or trophies," he said softly, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. He reached out, his tattooed hand hovering just inches from mine on the desk. "They don't see the cost of the armor." The silence that followed wasn't heavy with threat, but with an unexpected, searing intimacy. In the heart of his fortress, the Mafia king and the tech queen were no longer playing roles. We were just two people who had learned that the only way to stay standing was to never let them see you bleed. The ballroom of the Lotte Signal was a gilded cage of old money and new blood, illuminated by chandeliers that dripped like frozen rain. To the elite of Busan, this was a celebration of the maritime merger. To the man whose arm I held, it was a minefield. Taehyun looked lethal in a midnight blue tuxedo, his hand resting possessively at the small of my back, his thumb tracing slow, absent-minded circles against the silk of my gown. "Smile, Aari," he murmured, his breath brushing my temple as we navigated a sea of bowing sycophants. "Half the men in this room want to kill me, and the other half want to buy you. Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing your teeth. I'm not smiling because I'm focused on not tripping over your ego, I whispered back, leaning into him to complete the illusion. And for the record, I'm not for sale. My Series A saw to that. The music shifted, a low, haunting cello arrangement that signaled the start of the formal dance. Taehyun led me to the center of the floor, the crowd parting like a black sea before a predator. When he took my hand, the air between us seemed to ignite. This wasn't the sterile negotiation of his office or the quiet vulnerability of the library. This was theater, and we were the lead actors in a tragedy. He pulled me flush against his chest, his hand splayed wide across my spine. The warmth of his palm seeped through the thin fabric, a steady heat that made the rest of the room fade into a blurred mosaic of gold and shadow. As we moved, the rhythm of the waltz felt less like a dance and more like a confrontation. Every turn was a test of balance, every glance was a challenge. "You're a natural," he said, his voice dropping to that private, dangerous frequency. "Most women tremble when I hold them this close." "Most women haven't spent 5 years pitching to Silicon Valley sharks," I retorted, though my breath hitched as he spun me inward, his face inches from mine. "You're just another shark, Taehyun, just with better tailoring." He didn't pull away. Instead, his gaze dropped to my lips, lingering long enough to make the pretend feel terrifyingly real. For a heartbeat, the crowned serpent disappeared, replaced by the man who had looked at my hands and seen the weight of my armor. The friction of our bodies, the scent of his sandalwood cologne, and the defiant spark in my own eyes created a vacuum where only we existed. The song ended with a dramatic swell of strings. We stood frozen in the center of the floor, the silence of the room returning like a physical weight. He didn't let go immediately. His grip lingered on my waist, his eyes dark with a hunger that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with the woman in his arms. "Careful, little bird," he whispered, his voice roughened by something he couldn't mask. "If you keep looking at me like that, they'll start to believe the lie. And so will I." The blue light of my customized neural interface monitors pulsed like a steady heartbeat in the darkened command center. For hours, I'd been stress testing the logistics encryption I'd built for Taehyun's legal shipping arm, but something was snagging. It was a phantom signal, a microscopic leak of data that shouldn't have existed. "You're still awake?" Taehyun's voice drifted from the doorway. He had traded his tuxedo for a charcoal sweater, looking less like a king and more like a man haunted by his own shadows. "Your firewall has a ghost, Taehyun," I said, my fingers flying across the haptic keyboard. "Someone isn't just stealing data. They're using the back end of my fashion tech style matching algorithm to camouflage troop movements. They're hiding logistics for a coup inside dress shipments." Taehyun was at my side in 2 strides, his hand gripping the back of my chair. His scent, sandalwood and cold rain, clouded my focus for a fraction of a second before the data turned red. "Trace it," he commanded, his voice dropping into that lethal, low-frequency rasp. "If someone is using your work to dismantle mine, I want a name." "I'm already in," I whispered. I felt a surge of adrenaline that rivaled the heat of our dance. This was my battlefield. They think they're clever, but they're using an old Busan Port Authority handshake protocol. Look. I swiped a holographic window into the air between us. A map of the Busan docks flickered to life, dotted with pulsing amber nodes. One node was blinking inside the estate, specifically from the communications wing. Taehyun's jaw tightened, the serpent tattoo on his neck appearing to tighten with his pulse. "Minnow," he breathed, his most trusted lieutenant, the man who had sat at his table for a decade. "He's opening the secondary gates at 300, I said, my eyes scanning the cascading lines of code. If I reroute the signal now, I can lock him out of the system and loop the security footage so they think the gates are open when they're actually deadbolted. Taehyun looked down at me, and for the first time, the wall between us didn't just crack, it vanished. He didn't see a little bird or a liability. He saw an equal. He reached down, his hand covering mine on the interface, his skin searingly hot against my own. "Do it, Aari," he said, his eyes burning with a dark, newfound respect. "Lock them in. If we're going to burn this treason out, I want you at the helm of the fire." In that moment, we weren't a kidnapper and his captive, or even a king and his partner. We were a single, devastating unit. As I struck the final key to seal the traitor's fate, I realized the danger wasn't just the men outside the gates. It was the fact that I was starting to like the way it felt to rule at his side. The restaurant was a glass jewel perched on the edge of a jagged cliff, overlooking the churning black waters of the East Sea. Taehyun had cleared the entire floor, a rare gesture of normalcy that felt more like a truce than a date. No bodyguards stood at the table. They were shadows in the hallway, leaving us alone with the sound of the waves and the heavy, unspoken tension of the night before. "You're quiet," Taehyun said, watching me over the rim of his wine glass. The candlelight softened the sharp angles of his face, making him look almost human, almost reachable. "I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop," I admitted, swirling the dark liquid in my glass. "In your world, quiet usually means the storm is about to break." He reached across the table, his fingers grazing mine, a touch that was becoming a dangerous habit. "Tonight the storm stays outside, Aari. I promised you one night where you weren't a target." The promise was shattered a second later. It started with a high-pitched chirp from my wrist, the silent haptic alarm on my watch tied to the estate's perimeter sensors. Before I could speak, the floor-to-ceiling glass to our left exploded in a crystalline wave. Taehyun didn't hesitate. He didn't look for his weapon or check his own perimeter. In one fluid, violent motion, he lunged across the table, his weight slamming into me as he tackled me to the floor. We skidded across the hardwood, just as a second muffled thud sent a bullet whistling through the space where my head had been a breath ago. "Stay down!" he roared, his voice stripped of its calm veneer. I looked up and saw a side of the Korean Mafia king the legends never mentioned. His face wasn't cold, it was twisted with a raw, jagged desperation. His hands, usually so steady, were trembling as he checked my shoulders, my neck, his eyes frantically searching for blood that wasn't his. "Aari? Aari, look at me!" he hissed, his breath coming in ragged hitches. He was shielding my body with his own, his broad back a wall of muscle and Kevlar against the window. Another shot ricocheted off the metal table leg, and I saw him flinch, not from pain, but from the terrifying realization of how close the round had come to me. For a man who had survived a dozen betrayals and walked through fire to claim his throne, he looked utterly undone. It's the first time I saw it, the crack in the crowned serpent's armor. He wasn't afraid of the assassins in the dark. He was terrified of a world where I didn't exist. "I'm okay, Taehyun. I'm not hit," I whispered, my hand finding the back of his neck, feeling the frantic beat of his pulse against his ink. His eyes met mine, dark and wild. "They touched you," he rasped, the panic curdling into a cold, murderous fury that promised to burn Busan to the ground. "Thought actually to take you."
The war room was a tomb of cold marble and sharp edges. The council of elders, men who had bled with Taehyun's father and helped him rebuild his empire from the ashes of betrayal, sat in a row of high-backed chairs, their expressions as rigid as the laws they enforced. I stood in the doorway,
unnoticed, the shadows of the corridor concealing my presence as their voices rose in a chorus of calculated cruelty. "She is a leak in the hull, Taehyun," Elder Choi spat, his voice like dry parchment. "Since the Nigerian girl arrived, you have missed 3 shipments. You have ignored a direct challenge from the Seoul Syndicate. You are compromised." Taehyun sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of stone, but I saw the way his knuckles whitened against the armrest. "She is not a distraction," Taehyun said, his voice a low, warning rumble. "She is a partner. Her technology saved our logistics from a mole you all failed to see." "She is a weakness," another voice boomed. "The serpent has no heart. That is why he survives. But you? You look at her and the world sees a target. If you do not eliminate this variable, we will do it for you. For the sake of the dynasty, she must be removed." The silence that followed was suffocating. I felt the weight of it in my lungs, the cold reality of being a variable in a mathematical equation of power. I expected a negotiation. I expected him to offer a compromise, to hide me away, or to bargain for my life with pieces of his territory. Instead, Taehyun stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and terrifying. He didn't look at the maps or the ledgers. He walked to the window, looking out at the city he had conquered, before turning back to the men who had raised him. "You speak of the dynasty as if it is a god," Taehyun said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "But a dynasty built on the blood of the only person who sees me as a man and not a weapon is an empire of dust." He walked to the center of the room and unpinned the silver serpent brooch from his lapel, the symbol of his absolute authority. He dropped it onto the table. It hit the wood with a hollow, final clack. "If my heart is a weakness, then I am no longer your king," he declared, his gaze sweeping over them with a lethality that made the elders shrink back. "From this moment, the council is dissolved. Anyone who mentions her name with a threat in their throat will not live to see the sunrise. I am burning the old laws. If you want a ruler without a heart, go find a corpse, because I'm choosing her." He turned and saw me then, standing in the shadows. He didn't look like a king who had just lost a throne. He looked like a man who had finally found his soul. The silence of the estate was the first warning. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a Busan dawn, but a hollow clinical vacuum. When Taehyun kicked open the door to my workspace and found only my tablet, screen cracked, the neural interface still humming with a severed connection, the world as he knew it ended. The council had struck back, not with words, but with a theft that tore the breath from his lungs. They had taken me to the pit, an abandoned industrial shipyard at the edge of the docks, a place where the serpent's enemies went to vanish. Taehyun didn't call for a tactical retreat. He didn't wait for his loyalists. He became a force of nature, a monochromatic blur of rage and precision. He moved through the shipping container labyrinth of the docks like a reaper. Every guard that stood between him and the center of the yard wasn't just defeated, they were dismantled. The crowned serpent had shed his tailored skin, revealing the primal, blood-soaked creature underneath. His silk shirt was torn, the black and silver tattoos on his arms glistening with sweat and the spray of a war he was winning through sheer, terrifying will. Inside the warehouse, I was bound to a steel chair, the cold edge of a knife held by Elder Choi's youngest son. But I wasn't looking at the blade. I was looking at the doors as they were ripped off their hinges. Taehyun stepped into the light, his eyes no longer dark,
but burning with a predatory fire that made even his captors freeze. He didn't look like a man. He looked like a judgment. "Drop it," Taehyun rasped, his voice a jagged edge of glass. He wasn't holding a gun. He didn't need one. He held a heavy iron rod, the end trailing on the concrete with a terrifying screech. "Touch her again, and I won't just kill you. I will erase your name from the history of this city." "She's just a girl, Taehyun," the boy screamed, his hand shaking. "She's your ruin." "She is my world," Taehyun countered, his voice suddenly, chillingly calm. In a movement too fast for the human eye to track, he lunged. He didn't flinch when a bullet grazed his shoulder. He didn't slow down when the warehouse erupted in chaos. He carved a path through the remaining council loyalists with a brutality that felt like a holy rite. When he finally reached me, the knife wielder lay incapacitated, and the silence returned, heavy, metallic, and absolute. Taehyun dropped to his knees in front of me, his blood-stained hands trembling as he fumbled with the zip ties. The fury vanished instantly, replaced by a raw, naked terror. "Aari," he choked out, his forehead leaning against my knees once I was free. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I pulled his head to my chest, my fingers tangling in his dark hair, feeling the violent tremor of his body. He had destroyed an empire in 20 minutes to get to me, and as I held him, I realized he would have burned the entire world if I'd asked him to. The smoke from the shipyard fire lingered on the horizon, a grey shroud over the rising Busan sun. The council was gone, their greed buried under the weight of Taehyun's fury, and the city felt strangely light, as if it had finally exhaled after decades of holding its breath. We stood on the balcony of the penthouse, the same place where I had first wandered into the wrong room, but the air between us had shifted from cold glass to something living and warm. Taehyun stood at the railing, his shoulder bandaged beneath a fresh black shirt, his gaze fixed on the ports. The empire was scarred. His influence had been chipped away by the purge, and the underworld was whispering of the king who had broken his own crown. Yet he didn't look like a man who had lost. "They'll come for the throne," he said softly, not looking back. "The vacuum left by the council won't stay empty for long. It will be a climb, Aari, harder than the first time. I am a man with a visible heart now." I walked up behind him, sliding my arms around his waist and leaning my cheek against the sturdy breadth of his back. I could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart, the pulse they said he never had. "Then we'll build a different kind of throne," I whispered. "One that doesn't require us to be ghosts." He turned in my arms, his hands coming up to cup my face with a tenderness that still felt like a miracle. The silver serpent on his arm was visible as his sleeve shifted, but it no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a guard.
"I never believed in love, but you made me to."
"I spent my life believing that attachment was a death warrant," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. "I thought the only way to be untouchable was to be alone. I was wrong. I was just a ruler of shadows." He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. "Loving you didn't make me weak, Aari. It gave me something I never had before. It gave me a reason to survive the war." I looked up at him, my partner, my protector, my equal. "The crowned serpent is dead," I said, a small smile playing on my lips. "Long live the king," he replied, but the way he kissed me, slow, desperate, and full of a future he had finally dared to imagine, told me he didn't care about the title. We weren't just a story of survival anymore. As the sun broke over the water, painting the city in shades of gold and rose, I knew we were the beginning of a new dynasty. One built not on fear or ink, but on the wreckage of everything we had burned down to find each other.